So today, I'd like to highlight another mass movement that's going on in this country that deserves media attention. And they probably won't get it until maybe a couple of weeks from now, or maybe if the circumstances, unfortunately, were to become tragic. And by that, I mean the California prison hunger strike. Last week, we reported to you that this strike had resumed after earlier in the year when 6,000 protesters across the state refused food, asked for their conditions to be more humane, and especially for the practice of solitary confinement to come to an end. Now, after the initial strike that began at the Pelican Bay prison, and some prisoners becoming incredibly weak, saying that they were willing to die for this movement, all they got were beanies, wall calendars, and they were allowed to participate in correspondence courses. That is a really sad and pathetic attempt to make amends by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, considering the California prisons are so overcrowded that the Supreme Court ruled last May that there are serious constitutional violations there, and that approximately 37,000 prisoners would have to be released or moved elsewhere. So now this prison strike has resumed, and according to Prison Hunger Strike Solidarity, there are nearly 12,000 prisoners involved now, including California prisoners that are being housed in out-of-state prisons in Arizona, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. Now, they say the changes promised after the July hunger strike never materialized, including, of course, their desired demands to change the practice of solitary confinement and gang validation. This time around, they also say that they'll be performing rolling hunger strikes so the prisoners can come off strike and will be able to regain their strength. That doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be out of harm's way, though. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has already delivered memos to prisons threatening disciplinary actions if they participate. Now, that's something that can't be ignored. We have the largest known incarceration system in the world. More than half of those people are in the system for nonviolent offenses. And using tactics that amount to torture or even depriving these individuals of basic humane treatment, as is protected under our Constitution, that's wrong. Now, worst of all, these are the people that have no voice. They can't even go out on the street and protest. They need public support. They need the media to call attention to what's going on. But for now, this is what the mainstream media is more than happy to miss.
We have received letters from prisoners in Pelican Bay for many years. These men have written letters to legislators, to governors, to lawyers, to courts, to media. You may yourselves have received letters. And they, after many years of harsh and horrible conditions, seeing no change, they have come to the understanding that they are not going to get change unless they do something like this. There's a so-called gang investigators who gather information and allege that you're a gang member. There's a disproportionately high number of jailhouse lawyers and political activists in the SHU that have no contact necessarily with any gang at all. It's used in this way. Have not seen a blade of grass, anything in nature for decades. You just see a patch of the sky. They're not allowed. Their ability to communicate with others is limited, quite limited. They are not allowed phone calls at all. And of course, the prison was selected in that location because it's as far away as possible in the state from the location where the majority of people in prison come, which is the Los Angeles area. Even from the Bay Area, it's a good 7-hour drive to get up there, and all of this was intentionally designed to cut off family contact, to make it as painful as possible, and it is psychologically painful.
Coalition is acting in solidarity to amplify the voices of the prisoners. We also speak as human rights advocates for basic human rights, and we speak as concerned citizens who care about our communities, because torture and this kind of sensory deprivation and solitary confinement not only destroys the human beings experiencing it, that's happening in our name as citizens of California, but also it impacts communities where these prisoners will be returning to. So we believe that it is essential to bring out the voices and to speak about this level of conditions that are happening on the inside, where people are not able to bring their voices out, but only speak through correspondence, where correspondence is read, monitored, restricted, and held back.
I actually had a chance to read a document that was circulated in the California Correctional Peace Officers Association newsletter. It's called The Peacemaker. And they had an article about Pelican Bay. And the name of the article actually was A Fate Worse Than Death. At the end of the article, they posted predators and nonconformists. California now has a place for you. The nonconformist is basically your political prisoner who doesn't conform to the prison culture.
I'll smoke some hay. You bitches wanna throw me up in Pelican's Bay. Call me an animal up in the system. But who's the animal that built this prison? Who's the animal invented lower living? The projects.
Me, one who was sent to Maryland not for killing anyone, not for stabbing anyone, but giving a speech to the NAACP about the conditions and the racism in USP Terre Haute. The warden said, whatever takes place in this prison, we deal with it in here. It's not for the outside. I told him he was a coward, but he was scared, and I'm going to say what I have to say, and whatever happened to me will happen. They put me in SHU, Special Housing Unit, and told me I would be transferred. It was a disciplinary transfer because they said my speech.
You're only supposed to go to these prisons if you had committed an egregious violation at some other penitentiary. You were sent here, and they said because of your political actions and political beliefs, this is the only effective management control that we have here.
You get guards, white guards, go to white prisons and say, those niggas are doing this and they're doing that, and then they go to the black shit. Watch out for these white guys, man. They're talking all kinds of nigger shit and, burning you guys out. And it was divide and conquer. This is the methodology of the Department of Corrections. It does not rehabilitate. It has no vested interest in rehabilitation. Its only interest is in control.
Run through our homes, throw us in cells, rather us in jail than free on the street. 'Cause if we free on the streets, we can speak to our peeps.
The management control unit in New Jersey was built for Sundiata Acol. There are hundreds. For the people of my generation, the work that we're doing now and the work that we've done is compelling. It's a lifetime commitment. We made a promise to those dead and alive to abolish these torture chambers. And I think with Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and the secret prisons throughout, U.S. prisons throughout the world, people are beginning to understand.
I remember getting a letter from a guy he sent his survey back and he said, I sit here in this windowless tomb. He said, but I'm okay. I've been here 37 years. And I just broke down crying, because I can't imagine someone being in a 6x10 room out for a half an hour, if they're lucky, a day, and being there for 37 years. And I was just wondering, what could he have possibly done, for them to keep him in there for 37 years.
Pelican Bay hunger strike is about resisting torture and intimidation by the prison administration in California. I believe it relates to the history of prison resistance as people get tired and frustrated and needing to coordinate and come together to stop inhumane conditions.
The hunger strike is about I won't even say conditions of confinement. I'll say the torture that the men in the segregated and secured housing units are going through in Pelican Bay and in Corcoran and other prisons.
one of the main ways that people are placed in the SHU for indefinite periods of time is to be validated. In other words, the prison officials say that somebody has identified you as a gang member. Now, there is no way for you to ever find out who did that, what was said, or even if anything was said at all. It's all based on, it's all secret. There's no way you can protest or litigate against that. You are stuck in the SHU until and unless you debrief, which basically means you snitch on somebody else and get that person to take your place, whether it's another inmate, whether it's somebody in your family, or whether it's someone even in your hometown. And these prisoners refuse to do that. Many of them were put in on that basis, but I think we have to respect their moral certitude in saying, I will not be part of putting someone in this torture just for myself to get out.
According to Teeter, prisoners were essentially tricked into ending their hunger strike earlier this year. He says officials with the Department of Corrections made a few small concessions and told prisoners they would negotiate on their 5 demands if prisoners ended their strike. Teeter says officials never came through, though, and he says this time around there's been more retaliation than there's ever been before.
All the hunger strikers are not able to be seen by their family. The visits have been canceled. The lawyers and mediators have been barred from the prison.
But do something more than just be a spectator, than just be a symbolic activist. You need to become involved, because my fear as a former prisoner is that the only way change will happen is, unfortunately, if we look back at 1981 Ireland, when Bobby Sands and 9 other people had to pass away before the government took this seriously. I don't want anyone, Arturo Castellano, I don't want Todd Asher, I don't want Dewberry, I don't want Antonio Guillen, I don't want any of these other people to have to pass away before America, before California, before our legislators, and before CDC gets the message. So I'm encouraging people to act now, because we're on the 10th day of a hunger strike, and it's getting very serious, and people will die, especially since they're blacking out. They're not allowing attorneys to go in, they're not allowing loved ones to be to see their loved ones, and they're also holding a lot of these people incommunicado.
One of the most poignant things that was said in a letter from a prisoner recently was that prisoners who are incarcerated in Pelican Bay and in Pelican Bay, I should say, actually do not see the sun for decades. And another thing, just for your viewing audience to understand the nature of the problem, they don't hear music for decades. Just imagine being in a situation where you will hear music no more.
Well, Clyde, could you tell us about your personal situation? Like you said, again, you were in solitary confinement for a time. A lot of international organizations would say that that's something that amounts to torture. Would you describe it that way?
I would absolutely describe it that way. If you look at the conditions, and I'd like to focus on the conditions that tens of thousands of prisoners are facing today. Their estimates are up to as high as 100,000 prisoners are confined in isolation cells. And at Pelican Bay, what I understand is that prisoners are in a cell no larger than a small bathroom. They have a concrete slab protruding from the wall, which is their bed, and they have a sink and a toilet. And it's a soundproof room. And I should say it's a soundproof, what prisoners have described as a tomb. And they're confined there for 22.5 hours a day. And whenever they leave their cells, they have to be handcuffed and cavity searched. This is nothing less than torture to confine human beings under these circumstances. And I think there's absolutely no justification for it at all. Oftentimes they're denied of reading material, and they're also prevented from having materials like colored pencils so that they can draw, and they hear no music. I mean, just think of yourself if you were confined to a small space for 10, 20, 30 years and have no access to music or anything like that. This is just torture. There's absolutely no justification for it, either inside the borders of the U.S. or outside the borders of the U.S.
Now, apparently some of these prisoners reportedly are in horrible health. Some are saying that they're willing to die for this cause. Do you think that if there were some fatalities here, that would change the system at all?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the prisoners have said that they're willing to die, but they don't want to. The demands that they have raised are completely just and legitimate demands. They're not outrageous demands. You have articulated what some of them are. They've also said the end to long-term solitary confinement, and also the end to the practice of what the prison officials call gang validation, where someone on the word of another prisoner or on the word of a guard with absolutely no evidence whatsoever can be labeled as a gang member and confined in Pelican Bay in the security units.
We cannot stress enough how critical the situation is. The health of some of these prisoners has deteriorated to the point of it being potentially fatal. So the time now is for the CDCR to negotiate with the prisoners, or they are responsible for the death of these prisoners. The first speaker is going to be Carol Strickman, who is a lawyer for the Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition.
The coalition is doing the best we can to get up-to-the-minute information as to what's going on. We're sending in legal interviews, and we're receiving information from many sources.
The people surrounding us in the background are all members of the Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition. It's important for us to remember and think about that one of the main requests that the prisoners made was for support on the outside. So there's been people that have been working around the clock to gain the most basic of human rights for these prisoners. So we are demanding that CDCR negotiate with these prisoners. We're asking for legislators and politicians to visit the prison to get to demand answers. We're asking members of the public to stay informed. You can do that by visiting www.prisonerhungerstrikesolidarity.wordpress.com. There's a lot of information on the background of Pelican Bay and the different actions that people are taking and actions that you can take yourself. Once again, we consider this situation to be critical and dire, and we hope that everybody take action. For members of the press, we hope that you continue covering this issue and investigating it further.
Prisoners in the units are kept in total isolation for 22.5 hours a day. Punishment some mental health experts say can lead to insanity and is tantamount to torture. Democracy Now! Obtained a recording of an audio statement that one of the Pelican Bay inmates, Ted Ashker, made to his legal team in the Secure Prisons Secure Housing Unit, which is referred to as the SHU. You will need to listen closely as he explains his reasons for joining the hunger strike.
The basis for this protest has come about after over 25 years, some of us 30, some up to 40 years of being subjected to these conditions. The last 21 years at Pelican Bay SHU, where every single day you have staff and administrators who feel it's their job to punish the worst of the worst as they put out propaganda for the last 21 years that we are the worst of the worst. And most of us have never been found guilty of ever committing an illegal gang-related act, but we're in SHU because of a label. And all of our 602 appeals, numerous court challenges have gotten nowhere. Therefore, our backs are up against the wall. A lot of us are older now. We have serious medical issues coming on, and we believe that this is our only option of ever trying to make some kind of positive changes here is through this peaceful protest of hunger strike. And there's a core group of us who are committed to taking this all the way to the death if necessary. None of us want to do this, but we feel like we have no other option, and we're just hoping for the best.
That was Todd, not Ted. Todd Ashker, one of the prisoners in Pelican Bay Secure Housing Unit, who was on hunger strike. In May, the federal Supreme Court ruled that California must reduce its prison overcrowding to be able to provide inmates with adequate health care. In a 5-4 ruling, the court said conditions in California's prison system are, quote, incompatible with the concept of human dignity, causing needless suffering and death. Supporters of the hunger strikers protesting these conditions say as the prisoners continue to refuse food, their health has deteriorated to critical levels.
For more, we're joined by 3 guests. In Oakland, California, we're joined by Dorsey Nunn, who's co-founder of All of Us or None. He's also executive director of legal services for prisoners with children. Nunn was incarcerated from 1971 to 82 at San Quentin. He's one of the mediators between the prisoners on hunger strike and the California Department of Corrections. Also joining us from the University of California, Berkeley, is Molly Porzik. She's member of the Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition, a spokesperson for critical resistance. And in Arizona, we're joined by Desiree Lozoya. She is the niece of a prisoner participating in the Pelican Bay hunger strike. She went to the prison last weekend and visited her uncle. Desiree, let's start with you. Tell us what your uncle explained to you, why he's on hunger strike and what's happening at Pelican Bay.
Well, basically, just as Ted had explained in his video clip, they're just wanting to be treated better. They're cold, they're losing weight, and like he had explained, a lot of these prisoners are trying to be basically gang labeled. However, there's nothing to be labeling them for. For instance, my uncle was an interstate transfer to Pelican Bay. He was supposed to be transferred closer to home. However, he was still transferred 17 hours away from us. And then as soon as they saw a tattoo on his hand, they labeled him right away. Although he's had no write-ups, has gotten into no trouble, they automatically put him in the Ad-seg, which is now the new SHU. They are now expanding that. And so that's where he sits.
Because they said the tattoo indicates he's a member of a gang?
Yes, and the tattoo he ended up getting when he was a teen. He was only 18 years old when he received the tattoo. It was in no gang affiliation whatsoever.
And we're also joined by Molly Porzik. She's a member of the Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition. Molly, talk about how this has spread to the rest of the California prison system.
Right, so on the first day of the hunger strike, thousands of prisoners across the state of California, more than 6,600 prisoners that we know of across at least 13 prisons, joined the hunger strike in solidarity with the prisoners at the Pelican Bay SHU and their demands. What's really significant about that is that people are risking their own lives and joining this action while being in very similar or even the same brutal conditions as the hunger strikers at Pelican Bay. And that speaks to the fact that while this struggle speaks to particular conditions at Pelican Bay and in the SHU, it's also part of the larger system within California, which was just mentioned, that has been condemned by the Supreme Court as inhumane and cruel due to severe medical neglect and overcrowding.
People are actually striking because they're being tortured. So I think that this strike has spread because torture is a threatening thing to anybody in the California Department of Corrections. People are being tortured. Some parts of what I know as a formerly incarcerated person who have did time within the California Department of Corrections, that they are guilty of torture. It's like being like, it's not like, people are being locked up in the bathroom for 23, 24, and 30 years. It may not have been torture maybe the first 30 days or the first 60 days, but when you start getting into multiple decades, then we can call it torture. When you start extracting information in Pelican Bay or Guantanamo Bay, the purpose is the same. You're torturing people. And I think under international standards, it can be referred to as that. I think the thing that is troubling that this thing is happening on the shores of the United States. We never did have to get into renditions if we were going to allow torture in Northern California.
And Dorsey,
so this thing is spreading.
Dorsey Nunn, what's been the response of prison officials or government officials? Have they attempted to negotiate or mediate through you or with the inmates?
I think that we into discussions. I wouldn't necessarily call it negotiating. We into discussions, you know. So I guess if I was in a cage with a 600-pound gorilla, you couldn't necessarily call it a dance.
And where
what you
go ahead, Dorsey.
You know, what brings me into this studio this morning at 5 o'clock in the morning is that I'm scared people are going to start dying. You know, the only model that these guys got left is the model of Bobby Sand and the Irish strike. That's their model. So these guys, you know, somebody needs to think about what would drive human beings.
Dorsey, you're talking about fasting to death. If you're talking about Bobby Sands.
Yeah, that's what they're talking about, and that's what they've been like. That's what I'm frightened of. So what brings me into your studio is I think they're betting on the compassion of people who live in the state of California and people who live in the United States. And what's frightening to me is that I don't know if that compassion really exists.
I mean, just to add to that, to back up to the question of what has the response of officials been, I mean, it's very, very clear that the CDCR is more than willing, if not wanting, people to start dying. They want this to go away quickly and quietly. They pride itself on Pelican Bay being the end of the line, not only for people in California, but to be a model for the United States and really the world in terms of how to repress political organizing and resistance and any sort of defiance to any sort of establishment. And I think that, you know, what the challenge is for supporters outside of prison is that we need to be tirelessly working at, in a very urgent way, taking the risks that we can to match the courage of these hunger strikers. Because like Dorsey is saying, people, it's not just that we're afraid of in a few weeks people dying, people are getting to that point now, and we need to be acting more. You know, historically, people have used civil disobedience to prevent mass death, and that's exactly the moment that we're in right now. That's exactly what these hunger strikers and thousands of prisoners across the state of California are doing. Some prisoners at Ohio State Penitentiary are also joining this. You know, so this is really, really huge, and
we have to leave it there.
If people start dying, if it gets to that point.
We have to leave it there, but I thank you so much all for being with us. We will certainly follow this hunger strike.
The 5 core demands are: 1, end group punishment and administrative abuse. 2, abolish the debriefing policy and modify inactive, active gang status criteria. 3, comply with the Commission on Safety and Abuse in America's Prisons 2006 recommendation to end long-term solitary confinement. 4, provide adequate food. 5, expand and provide privileges and programs to all people serving indefinite SHU term.
California's second inmate hunger strike in less than 6 months is now entering its second week. The State Department of Corrections says about 1,200 inmates in 4 prisons are participating in the hunger strike. But prisoner rights groups say as many as 12,000 inmates at 8 prisons are taking part. The current hunger strike grew out of a protest started in July by prisoners in Pelican Bay State Prison. Inmates are protesting extreme isolation cells known as security housing units, or SHU.
Long-term solitary confinement is a form of torture. It's the reality of it. It is a devastating form of psychological torture, and the state does not have a right to impose that on people.
The American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California is just one of several groups standing in solidarity with the hunger strikers. The list of supporters now includes Palestinian prisoners who are also hunger striking against torturous conditions of imprisonment in Israeli prisons.
Our prisons have to represent our basic norms as a society. They may be not pleasant places to be in, they may be somewhat harsh, but they can't be places where we torture people. That is inconsistent with a civilized society.
The original strike ended in late July after prison officials agreed to meet some basic demands. But the protest resumed on September 26th after inmates complained their concerns were not immediately addressed. Advocates say prison officials have responded by punishing the strike leaders and denying family visits to increase isolation.
We only get to write letters. We don't get to have a phone call from them while they're in the SHU. 8 years. I haven't had a picture from my son for 8 years, and there's many that are in the SHU longer than my son, up to 40-some years.
The Department of Corrections has also expelled 2 attorneys chosen by inmates to represent them on the mediation team. That team has been representing prisoners in negotiations with prison officials since July. These groups say they plan to continue to pressure California lawmakers to meet the inmates' demands and find ways to reform California's prisons.
These isolation units are isolation units within the isolation unit.
Prisoners to get out of the SHU that are quote-unquote gang-related, which could mean you talked to someone who was perceived as a gang member, or you had a tattoo they thought was gang related. One thing they tell them is to get out of the SHU that they need to debrief, which means they need to go and tell the CDCR staff everything they know or can think about or whatever about whoever else is in there in order to get to the main yard themselves.
I think that first of all, you have to look at the history of prison and the overall public view, which usually is provided to them by the media about prisoners, the sentiment about prisoners, almost like, prisoners being a garbage can in society.
You can go all the way back in California, specifically to the 70s, and the whole case around George Jackson and all that stuff started in Soledad. It was around torture, specifically aimed at the black prisoners, because the black prisoners were becoming politicized. A month after George Jackson was murdered came Attica, which was a very well organized strike. After that, there were many, many, many what were classified as riots in American prisons. Lots, more than we'll ever know about. Because prisoners saw that as a way to change their conditions.
What the hunger strike becomes is a tool, a last resort. When you go through the administration, through petitions and you're ignored, when you go through the criminal justice system and are ignored.
Some of the men said they're prepared to die this time, because they feel like they're being killed slowly anyway. So
they chose the only weapon that they can use at their disposal, and that's at themselves.
At some point, prisoners say no more. So I believe this Pelican Bay hunger strike is a testament to no more torture.
What the people can do to help these people is raise the voice. Word is amplifying the voice. And what is amplifying the fact that they're saying help.
It's about exposure. It's about exposure. It's about media. It's about to get people to talk about it.
Sign on to the demands. Sign on to the petitions. Use Facebook, use Twitter, use whatever you have at your disposal, whatever tools you have to help amplify the voice.
Family members, they need to write letters, make phone calls to their legislators. They need to participate in rallies or protests. They need to call the warden or prison officials and constantly ask about their loved ones, and they just need to be involved.
We need a movement that can be united and respectful of each other and the people that it's supposed to be supporting. And we can't do that if we don't practice.
And as people continue to protest and say no more and fight and ask for assistance on the outside, then more people will know that the conditions that people live under inside is not acceptable.